In the hush that always seemed to settle like a soft blanket over the Providence Municipal Courtroom the day the television cameras were rolling, a woman with a face tight as a clenched fist strode forward and planted herself before Judge Frank Caprio's bench, her jaw set, voice like gravel, and the air between the public seats and the carved wooden rail crackled with a kind of raw tension that made those watching, reporters with notepads, neighbors who had come to observe, and a handful of regulars who treated the courtroom like a community center, lean ever so slightly forward to catch every syllable. She called herself Denise, mid-30s, wearing a leather jacket zipped to the throat and boots that had walked through more than a few storms, and from the moment she opened her mouth to speak, a cascade of exasperation spilled out, a story of tickets she insisted were unjust, of repeated stops for what she called minor infractions that had snowballed into fines, license points, and an oncoming suspension. And the volume of her complaint wasn't just about the tickets, but about a life she felt being micromanaged by a system that, in her view, didn't see the human consequences behind every stamp on a citation. She was furious because she depended on her car, an aging sedan with more dents than a veteran, to shuttle her to 2 jobs, to ferry her young son to daycare, and to chase medical appointments for her aging mother, and she painted a picture of a single parent working double shifts, scraping together paychecks, and then having a chunk of them disappear beneath the relentless grind of fines that seemed to multiply like a debt that fed itself. And when she slammed a crumpled stack of papers on the podium, photocopies of fees, notice letters, a parking ticket with a blurry photo she argued didn't show her car clearly, her hand trembled not from shame, but from a fierce indignation that came from feeling cornered and unheard. Judge Caprio listened with that gentle intensity that had become his hallmark, a face that could be stern yet sympathetic, eyes that seemed to weigh each word as if carrying the lives behind them on their scales. And when Denise's voice hit a fevered pitch and she accused the system of being designed to squeeze the poor, the courtroom murmured because her accusation touched a chord many felt but rarely voiced aloud in such an official place, a place usually ruled by dry statutes and measured procedure. After she finished, breath hitching, words tumbling away like stones from a collapsed wall, the judge asked her calmly to sit down and tell him the facts. And though she had come prepared with fury, she found herself unspooling the hours and days of her life instead, naming nights she had slept at the wheel waiting for a cooling engine to finish its own grieving, winters where parking meters nicked at the heels of bills, and mornings where a single traffic stop could mean missing a shift and losing wages that would never be caught up. And as she spoke, the edges of her anger softened into a raw portrait of exhaustion and relentless pressure. The officer who had issued the citation, a young man with neatly cut hair and a respectful posture, stood to offer his version, that he had observed a turn signal neglected, a stop sign rolled through, or a parking regulation ignored, depending on the citations in question. And he calmly explained the municipal code, the safety rationale behind the enforcement, and how officers were instructed to issue tickets in accordance with law, not malice. But Denise interrupted at one point, her voice sharp as a snapped wire, accusing the officer of missing context, of ignoring that she had been forced into impossible choices, that survival sometimes required bending rules in a world that refused to soften for those scraping by. As Judge Caprio watched the exchange, he didn't allow the conversation to become a battle of wills, but invited each side to say what they felt needed saying, coaxing stories out like small, reluctant blossoms, denials of wrongdoing at times, reluctant confessions at others, and always the hum of human complexity that reality often denied in the black and white of ticketing forms. Then, as if the courtroom itself were a stage where quiet revelations like to happen unannounced, Denise, after speaking of lost paychecks and missed school events, told the judge something else, something that made the room lean in as if the very walls wished to hear. She had been recently diagnosed with a chronic illness that made unpredictable flare-ups part of her daily life,
a condition that meant she sometimes had to make sudden and urgent trips for medication or treatments, and the fear of being immobilized by fines and license suspension sat on her like a lead cloak, making the difference between attending a required medical appointment and being trapped at home in a painful limbo. The judge's eyes softened further at this, and he asked, with that gentle intensity that had become his hallmark, about documentation, about the nature of her work, about her support system. Questions meant not to pry, but to help the court understand whether the machinery of law was grinding down a person already carrying too much weight. Denise admitted she had no steady childcare if she had to take long hospital stays, that her son sometimes slept at neighbors' houses when she had night shifts, and that most nights she balanced a calculator against a pulse, measuring how to keep the household together without letting it collapse into disaster. And when she said she felt judged by the system as if poverty was a moral failing rather than a structural reality, a soft, uncomfortable silence settled over the room because her words scratched at an exposed nerve many felt but seldom voiced within the solemnity of municipal procedure. Judge Caprio paused, and there was that particular pause he had perfected over decades, an interlude that implied he had heard the human whole rather than a fragmentary complaint. And then, with the equal parts gentle gravity and judicial weight that made people trust him, he began to speak, choosing words like a careful gardener tending to fragile saplings, explaining that laws existed to preserve safety, to ensure order on roads and sidewalks and in communities, but that the purpose of justice was not to be blind to consequence, reminding everyone that true justice balanced fairness with mercy, and that sometimes the scales needed attentive recalibration to account for realities the statutes never spelled out. He acknowledged the officer's duty and the fairness of enforcement in a general sense, then turned the spotlight gently back to Denise, asking whether she would be willing to participate in a remedial program that combined community service, a payment schedule tailored to her income, and attendance at a municipal resource workshop designed to connect people with social services, subtle scaffolding meant to prevent future infractions by addressing underlying instability rather than merely punishing the visible outcomes. Denise furrowed her brow. This was no simple plea bargain of legalese, but a life-level negotiation. And she protested at first, her voice edged with suspicion, because had all the programs she'd been invited to in the past felt like doors that closed halfway, leaving her stranded once again. Yet the judge, with the patience of someone who had watched countless lives falter and then reclaim themselves in the wake of well-placed compassion, suggested an alternative, that the court could hold off on suspending her license and reduce the fines if she agreed to a plan that included verified medical appointments, a realistic repayment schedule based on her actual income, and community service hours specifically allotted to the municipal clinic that served people with chronic illnesses, thus ensuring her access to care while involving her in the network that could actually make a difference. An arrangement that would require commitment, but would also acknowledge her hardship and bind the city's goodwill with the accountability she needed. As she spoke, Denise's posture shifted imperceptibly, fury tempered by the fatigue of someone who had simply wanted to be heard, and the officer nodded, explaining that enforcement had never been intended to sabotage people's lives, but to protect public safety, and that flexible solutions existed so long as both sides were willing to step into a mutual understanding rather than face off. The judge then asked Denise if she understood that the court's leniency came with the expectation of responsibility, not a free pass. And she, with a voice chewed raw by emotion, said she understood, promising that she would do whatever was required so her son didn't suffer for her mistakes, and so her car would remain a tool for survival rather than a liability that could send her family spiraling into disaster. Before formalizing any decision, however, the judge did something that made the television feed crackle with a different sort of electricity. He invited Denise to tell the courtroom how it felt to live under the constant threat of license suspension, and she, eyes wet now but brow steadier, recounted a memory that left more than a few in the gallery with damp cheeks. A night when, exhausted from a double shift, she had misread a sign and parked in a restricted zone because her son's fever had spiked and she was rushing to a pharmacy 2 blocks away. And when she returned to find a ticket, she had felt like the city itself had slapped her across the face at the worst moment, reminding her that the world was often unkind to those already at the edge. The judge then surprised those expecting a perfunctory ruling by addressing the officer with a question of discretion. How had he weighed compassion against enforcement in prior similar cases, and was there room for judicially supervised flexibility that recognized the reality Denise had laid bare? The officer, honest and a touch uncomfortable, said that officers do exercise discretion when safety was not compromised, and that many departments had begun piloting.
Denise left the courthouse, clutching her reduced paperwork like a small treasure, eyes brighter yet wary, and a camera caught her speaking to a volunteer from the outreach program who promised to help schedule her appointments and connect her to local resources. And as she walked out into the bright winter sunlight, the crowd parted for her like a hallway of private wishes, people silently hoping this would be a real turning point. In the weeks that followed, the story rippled through the community, neighbors citing the judge's decision as an example of justice done well. City council members calling for meetings, the police department publicizing its new referral pathway for vulnerable citizens, and Denise, slowly, awkwardly, building a scaffolding of support that allowed her to breathe a little easier, to keep her son's school routine intact, and to see the car not as a potential sentence, but a lifeline she could, with care, maintain. And though the courtroom news cycle would eventually move on, new cases would arrive, new people would take the stand with their own storms, and Judge Caprio would continue his daily work with the same measured compassion. That particular morning remained in the memory of many as a small but luminous example of how a measured, humane reply to anger could leave not someone speechless, but someone steadied, not silenced, but heard. And in that listening was the beginning of a better kind of law, one that recognized that beneath the infraction, there was always a life worth understanding. In the days following her explosive appearance in Judge Caprio's courtroom, Denise found herself replaying the exchange in her head, how anger had carried her in like a storm, and how the judge's calm, measured reply had cracked something inside her that she hadn't realized was hardened. And though she had walked out clutching the reduced fines and the conditional agreement like fragile hope, she couldn't quite shake the weight of being seen, truly seen, in a way she'd spent years believing no authority figure cared to attempt. And as she drove home that afternoon with her son strapped safely in the back seat, humming half-finished songs to himself, she felt something stirring in her chest, not anger, not relief, but a strange mixture of fear and possibility, because for the first time in a long time, she had been asked to participate in her own healing rather than punished for her struggles. Yet the road ahead proved anything but simple. For the very next morning, life resumed its unrelenting pace. Her son spilled juice on his only clean shirt, her aging mother called, needing help untangling insurance paperwork. The car made a rattling noise that suggested an expensive repair. And Denise, exhausted but determined, reminded herself that this was the exact kind of chaos the judge had factored into her agreement, because he somehow understood that people like her didn't need perfection. They needed mercy, structure, and a chance to breathe. Meanwhile, inside the courthouse, Judge Caprio settled into a routine of new cases, new faces, and new stories. But Denise lingered in his thoughts more than most because she embodied a kind of bottled-up frustration he had seen grow in many who passed through those doors. People who weren't malicious or reckless, just overwhelmed and drowning in layers of systemic and personal hardships that made every small mistake feel catastrophic. And he hoped quietly that she would follow through with the plan, not for the court's convenience, but for her own stability. Because the alternative, a spiraling cycle of ignored fines, suspensions, impoundments, and court warrants, was a road he had seen too many good people tumble down. At the community clinic, where she had been assigned to complete part of her service hours,
Denise arrived on the first day with shoulders tense and chin lifted defensively, braced for judgment. But instead, she was met by a coordinator named Leela, a soft-spoken woman in her 40s with a warm, tired smile and eyes that seemed to understand more than they let on, who welcomed her as if she weren't a violator fulfilling an obligation, but a temporary teammate walking into a shared mission. And this subtle shift in tone disarmed Denise quickly, surprising her even more when Leela did not begin with instructions about sweeping floors or filing paperwork, but instead asked about her life, her diagnosis, her son, her schedule, and even her car situation, explaining that the clinic's outreach volunteers often faced similar challenges, and that she wanted to place Denise where she could learn and contribute without being overwhelmed. Denise agreed cautiously, and soon found herself helping the clinic contact patients who had missed appointments, updating files for those with chronic illnesses, and sitting in on educational sessions aimed at helping families navigate medication schedules, insurance hurdles, and lifestyle adjustments. And though she felt initially out of place, like an intruder in a world of medical jargon and structured compassion, she soon realized that the stories she heard mirrored her own fears, frustrations, and resilience. Parents choosing between medication and groceries, elders confused by shifting regulations, young people ashamed to ask for help, all caught in the same quiet storm she'd been surviving for years. On the third day, while Denise was organizing pamphlets, a woman in her late 20s came to the front desk in tears because a simple parking ticket had snowballed into hundreds of dollars she couldn't afford, making her afraid to drive to her next doctor's appointment. And as Denise watched her explain her situation, she felt a painful flicker of recognition. And before she knew it, she pulled up a chair beside the woman and for the first time in her life spoke not as someone who was suffering, but as someone who could guide another, recounting her own courtroom experience and the surprising sense of dignity Judge Caprio had restored in her. And when the woman wiped her tears and thanked her, she felt an unfamiliar warmth bloom inside her, a pride in being able to transform her hardship into something helpful. This feeling grew over the next weeks as Denise continued fulfilling her obligations, finding that the clinic community was not simply a place to log hours, but a kind of refuge where her struggles weren't anomalies, but part of a shared human thread, each person holding one broken piece of the world and offering it alongside others until something whole began to take shape. And she began to notice how much lighter her body felt when she wasn't bracing for conflict or assuming the worst of those around her. Yet outside the clinic's walls, her life remained a delicate balancing act. Her mother's health fluctuated unpredictably, her job schedules often overlapped with appointment times, and her school sent home yet another notice about unpaid fees. And Denise, though steadier now, still had moments where panic bubbled inside her like boiling water beneath a calm lid. Moments where she feared she would fail her obligations, lose her license again, or fall behind on payments she had promised to make. But each time she felt herself slipping into old patterns of defensive anger, she remembered the judge's steady voice, the deliberate pause he had given her, the compassion he had extended without demanding perfection in return. And it tempered her reactions just enough to regain clarity. Across town, the working group that Judge Caprio had formed began meeting monthly in the courthouse library. Police representatives, social workers, municipal employees, and community advocates gathered to discuss policy changes inspired partly by Denise's case. Ideas for better hardship accommodations, more transparent parking rules near hospitals, alternative ticket structures for low-income residents, and a streamlined referral program connecting ticket recipients with clinics, housing support, or legal aid before fines spiraled beyond control. And though these discussions moved slowly, burdened by bureaucracy and competing interests, the fact that they were happening at all marked a quiet shift toward the kind of systemic compassion the judge believed justice should embody. And he often wondered whether Denise had any idea how far-reaching the ripples of her initial confrontation had become. One afternoon, several weeks into her service hours, Denise was asked to accompany the clinic team to a community outreach event held at a local recreation center, a gathering aimed at offering free screenings and consultations to residents who couldn't afford regular checkups. and she hesitated out of insecurity, questioning what she could possibly offer, but Leela insisted that her presence mattered, reminding her that people related more easily to someone who had walked through the same struggles. And so she agreed, standing behind a table stacked with pamphlets, feeling awkward at first, until a long line of tired faces began approaching with questions about medical forms, chronic pain, insurance claims, and transportation barriers. And suddenly, she found herself guiding others the way she wished someone had guided her years earlier. Halfway through the event, a familiar voice asked gently, "How's that agreement working out for you?" And Denise turned to see Judge Caprio himself standing beside her table, visiting the outreach fair as part of his initiative to understand how community programs supported residents. And for a moment, the breath caught in her throat because she had never expected him to see her anywhere other than the courtroom. Yet here he stood, recognizing her not as a defendant, but as someone contributing to her community, and she felt her cheeks flush with a mixture of humility and pride as she explained how the clinic had become a stable space in her life, how she was learning to manage her illness with more structure, how her son was doing better, and how she had not fallen behind on her payment plan. The judge listened with sincere attentiveness, nodding occasionally, then told her how proud he was of her progress, how impressed he was by her involvement, and how her story had already begun inspiring conversations about rethinking ticket enforcement and municipal support systems. And Denise, unable to hold back her emotion, felt tears sting her eyes, not from sadness or anger, but from the unfamiliar feeling of being acknowledged for her growth rather than her failures. And when the judge eventually moved on to greet other volunteers, Denise stood straighter, feeling a new kind of strength in her spine, and she worked the rest of the event with renewed purpose, believing for the first time in years that she could build a life where she wasn't constantly running from crises, but moving toward stability. Yet, transformation is rarely smooth. And one evening, shortly after the event, Denise returned home to discover a bright orange slip tucked beneath her windshield wiper. A new parking ticket. And panic exploded inside her like a sudden storm, sending her heart racing and her vision narrowing, not because of the ticket itself, but because of the memories it triggered, the fear of spiraling again, the fear that everything she had built was fragile enough to crumble with one misstep. But after pacing through her apartment, she forced herself to breathe, forced herself to sit down, forced herself to read the ticket carefully. And as she did, she realized something almost unbelievable. The ticket had been issued incorrectly. The sign for the temporary restriction had been posted crookedly behind a tree, barely visible. And she remembered the judge's words about fairness, about evidence, about context. And instead of letting fury consume her, she gathered photos, wrote a concise explanation, and returned to court the next morning with clarity rather than fire. When her case was called, Judge Caprio looked genuinely pleased to see her again, and after reviewing her photos and explanation, he dismissed the ticket immediately, commending her for handling the situation responsibly and calmly.
Denise laughed softly, something she hadn't done in front of a judge in her entire life, and admitted that she had almost fallen back into her old reactions, but the tools she'd gained from the clinic and from his earlier judgment had helped her pause long enough to think. As she left the courtroom this time, there was no tension in her shoulders, no adrenaline pumping through her veins, only a sense of solidness, of having crossed some invisible threshold from survival mode into something closer to resilience. Months passed, and Denise officially completed her community service, maintained her medical appointments, kept her license in good standing, and even began volunteering at the clinic once a week simply because it felt meaningful. And her son, watching her transformation, began thriving in school, drawing pictures of mom helping people for his assignments, while Denise's mother, noticing the shift in her daughter's demeanor, remarked tearfully one afternoon that she hadn't seen Denise this hopeful since before life had become a relentless tangle. And though Denise never became wealthy, never gained the luxury of stability without effort, she carved out a life that felt fuller, steadier, and more dignified than anything she had imagined months earlier. And one crisp morning, when she arrived at the clinic,
Lila handed her a small envelope containing an offer for a part-time administrative support position, steady hours, reliable pay, and a clear path to full-time work, explaining that the clinic had been impressed by her empathy, her discipline, and her ability to connect with patients. And Denise, stunned, pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, realizing that what had begun as a punishment had become the doorway to a new chapter of her life. Meanwhile, Judge Caprio continued his courtroom work with quiet pride, occasionally hearing updates from the clinic about Denise's progress and smiling each time he learned she was thriving, because he knew, deep in his heart, that justice was never truly about delivering penalties. It was about unlocking paths, opening doors, helping people correct their course without crushing them under the weight of their circumstances. And Denise had proven that compassion, when paired with accountability, could transform not only a case file, but an entire life. And so the story that began with an angry woman storming into his courtroom ended months later, not in bitterness or silence, but in a quiet miracle of self-discovery, community, healing, and empowerment. A reminder to all who had witnessed it that sometimes the fiercest storms carry within them the seeds of unexpected change, and all that is required to break the cycle is one calm reply that allows a person to exhale long enough to grow. By the time spring unfolded across Providence and the city streets began to thaw from the long gray winter, Denise had settled into a rhythm of life that felt astonishingly new to her. Steady, structured, and touched by the quiet confidence of someone who had finally discovered she was more capable than the world had ever allowed her to believe. And as she walked into the clinic on a mild April morning, with a light breeze fluttering her jacket, she reflected on how different her days looked now compared to the chaotic blur